Thanks, Delana, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Katrina Crevens. I'm with the Georgian Bay Biosphere, and I'm pleased to be with you for the first of this two-part webinar series on invasive species. In today's webinar, which is made possible through a partnership with the Municipality of Whitestone, we are going to briefly cover what native and invasive species are and how they spread. And then we're going to take a closer look at two high-profile species, Japanese Knotweed and Phragmites. We'll talk about how to ID them and what to do if you find them in your yard or your neighborhood. We'll leave a good amount of time at the end for questions. We're actually super fortunate to have Brooke Harrison from Georgian Bay Forever here to help with questions about Phragmites management at the end. But before we get into it, I want to stress that the focus of this webinar is on what you can do as an individual or as a small community group. We won't be talking much about large infestations and the management approaches for those. If that is a topic of interest to you, we will be hosting another webinar in July looking at Phragmites management on a much larger scale than an individual property. I also want to be clear that this is only an introduction to Japanese Knotweed and Phragmites. There's tons and tons of great information out there on these species, and I'll provide some links to some of those resources in a follow-up email. The intent of this webinar is to be accessible to a wide audience, and so we won't get into really specific or really technical details. Again, the follow-up emails will have resources for folks to dive into all the nitty-gritty details if they'd like, but that's not quite the purpose of this webinar today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off to ensure I have the clearest connection possible, and then we'll get started. All right, so to start, what is a native species? A native species is a species that existed within this area prior to European settlement. Because they have evolved together over millennia, native species are connected to the plants and animals in their area. For example, think of the timing of insect hatches and the return of insectivores, birds that eat insects. These birds migrate back to this area when insects are available and abundant. So because these species have evolved together in this area over a very long time, they have that sort of relationship with each other. Native species are also well suited to the climate and soil of a region. And on the slide here, we have some examples of native species found within the biosphere region. Why should we care if there are native species in our local ecosystems? There's lots of advantages to native species. Because they're adapted to local conditions, they have natural predators or controls that keep their populations in check. If you're landscaping with native species, they typically require a lot less maintenance than horticultural species. They're generally drought tolerant and serve as food sources for local wildlife. And they integrate into the larger landscape. Species that come from other countries or regions and are introduced to our area are considered exotic or alien. They were not found here in the past and did not evolve in our specific regional conditions. There's many examples of these species that we now consider naturalized. So we know they're not originally from here, but they've successfully established populations and likely aren't going anywhere. Rainbow trout, for example, are one of the most widely introduced fish in Ontario, and that's something that most people don't actually know. They were first introduced to the Great Lakes in 1876, so they didn't always occur in this area, but we typically refer to them as naturalized rather than invasive. Oxide Daisy, or just common daisy, is another example of a non-native species that has been naturalized and likely isn't going anywhere. So what's the difference then between an exotic or alien species and the label invasive species? So the definition given by the Canadian government is plants, animals, and microorganisms introduced by human action outside their natural past or present distribution, whose introduction or spread threatens the environment, the economy, or society, including human health. Based on this definition, invasives are exotic or alien species that upset ecosystems and harm our environment, economy, or society. Sea lamprey, as shown in this photo on a nice looking lake trout, are a good example. They're a parasitic fish that were introduced to the Great Lakes in 1932 and have had a huge negative impact on lake trout populations in the Great Lakes. Let's talk a little bit about what invasive species have in common. What makes them so good at invading new areas? They typically have high rates of reproduction, meaning they produce lots of seeds, produce lots of eggs or offspring, spawn or mate more than once a year. Basically, they multiply quickly. Quick establishment means that they germinate, go to seed, mature, or grow faster than their native equivalents. And because they didn't evolve here, invasive species typically have few or no natural predators or controls. The reason these invasive species aren't considered invasive everywhere in the world is because in other areas, they have things that keep them in check, like predators, for example, so that they don't overrun ecosystems. Another common characteristic is the ability to adapt and thrive in a range of habitats and often in highly disturbed environments. In the definition of invasive species that we just went over, one of the key components was this idea of introduction by human action. Many of our actions inadvertently contribute to the spread of invasives. Now, we don't have time to go over each of these vectors, but I just wanted to provide some examples for context. So in the photo here, we see highways or roads as a vector for the spread of invasive Phragmites. This was a news story from earlier this year where mossballs, I believe they're aquatic plants that the people put in things like aquariums. When they were imported into Canada, some of them were found to have live zebra mussels, which are a highly invasive species as well. So there was an effort to essentially destroy any mossballs that were imported in a certain time period into the country. Now, this might sound a little kumbaya, but it really is everyone's responsibility to help prevent the spread of invasive species. Because there's so many potential vectors for spread, it's really important that everyone is vigilant. Carelessness by only a few people can have a hugely negative impact. So on the screen here, we have examples of different campaigns used to educate people and try to get people not to spread invasive species. So as we talk about Japanese knotweed and Phragmites, we're going to talk about reporting sightings of invasive species. And one way you can do this is through EDMAPS, which stands for Early Detection and Distribution Mapping System. It's a web-based mapping system for documenting invasive species distribution in Canada and also throughout the US. As of May 2021, so as of this month, EDMAPS had over 5.2 million records. As you can see from this screenshot of the website allows you to report sightings, to view distribution maps, and get information on different invasive species. So here we're looking at Phragmites or European common reed and kind of looking within some of the biosphere region to see where it's been identified. EDMAPS also has a phone app, which I personally think is a lot easier for reporting your sightings. You take photos right on your phone, and you have your GPS coordinates right on your phone, and you can upload those right on the spot instead of having to go back to a desktop or laptop and upload that information onto a website. The app is called EDMAPS Ontario, so you can find that in your app store or equivalent. All submissions to EDMAPS are reviewed by experts. So even if you're not sure about your identification, still do submit your sighting and an expert will determine whether it is in fact an invasive species. So don't shy away from submitting or reporting a sighting just because you're not totally sure about your ID. It will be reviewed and verified before being posted. If submitting a sighting on a website or through a phone app isn't for you, you can also report a sighting by calling the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters Invading Species Hotline, and the number is found here. You can either scribble that down or you can just Google search Invading Species Hotline and you shouldn't have a problem finding that. All right, so without further ado, let's get to the main attraction. We're going to talk about Japanese knotweed first and then Phragmites. Japanese knotweed is listed as one of the world's top 100 invasive species by the Global Invasive Species Database. It's a woody stemmed herbaceous perennial plant, meaning it comes back every year. It's actually native to Eastern Asia, so countries like Japan, Korea, and China, where it's relatively uncommon and, interestingly, is one of the first species to grow after eruptions or disturbance on volcanic slopes. It was introduced to North America as a horticultural plant in the 19th century, and like many others, it escaped cultivation and became an aggressive invader in North America. But not just in North America, they're also having issues with Japanese knotweed in and across Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. Japanese knotweed was first recorded in Ontario in 1901 in Niagara Falls, and today it's reported in many locations throughout southern Ontario and as far north as Thunder Bay. So here's a screenshot of the distribution of Japanese knotweed from EdMaps. So if you zoomed in or clicked on, say, like the Parry Sound area here, you would see in more detail where those sightings are from. Something that's really important and why we really encourage people to submit or report their sightings is that we know Japanese knotweed is in more places than are shown on these maps, but it takes people reporting them to improve our understanding of exactly how far it spreads and how prevalent it is in certain areas. This photo here shows, I took this photo yesterday, and it shows what Japanese knotweed looks like right now at this stage of growth. And this is what you might expect to see along roadsides. So this is the dead standing stalks of last year's growth. And coming in the green a little bit here, you can see there's shoots coming up in and amongst those dead, in and amongst the dead biomass there. So that's what you can expect to be seeing on the roadsides right now. Japanese knotweed grows in a wide range of habitats, including riparian areas, wetlands, roadsides, ditches. It grows most vigorously in full sun and prefers open exposed areas, but it also has no problem growing in deep shade in riparian zones. So those are the zones sort of around streams, rivers, and lakes. Similarly, while it prefers moist soils like those in riparian or wetland areas, it can also be found growing in drier, disturbed areas along roadsides, as is shown in this photo here, rail beds, and forest edges. So it has its preferences for full sun and open exposed areas, as well as moist soils, but it's able to grow in other diverse environments as well, which makes it so good at spreading. Japanese knotweed is salt tolerant and able to survive in extreme climates and even heavily polluted areas. So really all of this is to say that it finds a way to thrive in very diverse conditions. So we're not going to spend too much time on this, but I think it's important to have some idea of what this plant is capable of. So there's impacts on biodiversity. Japanese knotweed forms dense thickets of bamboo-like vegetation, aggressively outcompeting native plants and reducing sunlight penetration by more than 90%. So in a stand like this, if you were to go in the middle of the stand, sunlight penetration through that is going to be reduced by 90% or more, which makes it really hard for anything else to grow. Thick mats of decaying vegetation in the fall and spring also serve to prevent other species from growing by shading them out. And this happens to the point where native species ground cover within a stand of Japanese knotweed is typically reduced to 0%, so non-existent. Japanese knotweed simply does not support the same levels of native wildlife populations as our native species do. Japanese knotweed could also significantly damage infrastructure. It's able to grow through concrete or asphalt up to 8 centimeters thick, as well as building foundations, and you can see how it's doing that in this photo here. Despite the fact that Japanese knotweed has an extensive root and rhizome system, the roots surprisingly do not hold soil well in riparian areas. So where it's outcompeted our native vegetation, their root systems would hold the soil in place well and prevent erosion. But when Japanese knotweed moves in, it doesn't do the same thing. And so shorelines and stream banks can become quite unstable and really more vulnerable to erosion, where that may not have been an issue previously. And in terms of recreation, these dense stands can block or interfere with access to water. Okay, so how do we know if we're looking at Japanese knotweed? How do we identify it? We'll start with a stem here. So I've got a series of photos. This is what the dead standing biomass looks like, and you might still see a lot of that on the roadsides right now. The stems are hollow, smooth, and a purple to green color. You can be up to 1 inch in diameter. As you can see from this photo again, the stems will die back each fall and the dead stalks remain standing. The new stems emerge in spring, right about now, from the overwintering root system. And the juvenile stem resembles asparagus spears. So you can see that in this cut stem here. So that would be a very small amount of growth. And then this is kind of where we're getting to now here, about this height and this photo as well. The stems grow extremely rapidly, up to 8 centimeters per day. The plant as a whole can grow 1 meter in 3 weeks, with the mature plant reaching full height by the end of about July, and that's full height can be anywhere from 1 to 3 meters tall. So again, hollow, smooth, purple to green colored stems. You can see this is a young stem that's been broken in half. You can see how it's hollow there. Got this green and purple kind of blotchy coloration. Young stems looking like spears of asparagus. And this is probably the stage sort of where things are at on roadsides now that you can see grows up very, very quick. Rhizomes. So for those who aren't familiar, rhizomes are modified stems that run underground horizontally. They can strike out new roots out of their nodes down into the soil, and they can also shoot new stems up to the surface out of the nodes as well. Knotweed quickly develops large underground systems of roots and rhizomes, which account for 2/3 of the plant's total biomass. The rhizomes are dark brown on the outside and this really quite neat bright orange on the inside. The rhizomes can extend more than 2 meters deep and up to 14 to 18 meters in length and can spread outwards at a rate of about 50 centimeters per year in optimal conditions. And shockingly, pieces of stem or rhizome as small as 1 centimeter can produce new plants. And that's why when we're talking about control methods, it's so important to get at the entire plant. All parts of the plant material need to be taken out to eradicate this plant. The leaves of Japanese knotweed alternate along the stem, meaning that, so you've got a leaf on this side, they don't have a partner right on the other side. Instead, they go leaf, space, leaf, space. So it alternates in this kind of zigzag pattern. The shape of the leaves can vary a bit, but they're generally described as oval to triangular with a pointed tip and flat base. So you can see there's 2 photos here of leaves, and they look fairly different, but what you can see in both is the flat base there to a pointed tip, and you can see that in the other photo as well. The flowers are small and they're described as white-green. I think when I see them, I typically just think they look white, but they bloom in branching clusters in late July or August. And once you know what to look for, they're very obvious and they're really easily spotted along roadsides and in ditches at that time of year. The seeds are small, and winged, and they're described as being triangular shaped, but to me they look more like upside down hearts, but maybe that's just me. All right, so let's talk about what you can do on your own property. First and foremost is prevention. Help native plants thrive so that invasives don't have a chance to move in. Next, you want to keep a close eye on what is growing on your property. Learn how to identify common invasive species as we're doing today, and take note when something new arrives. Report any invasive species you see, not just on your property, but in your neighborhood as well. And if you do spot an invasive species on your property, acting early to eradicate it, or at the very least prevent the spread, is so important. If you've spotted Japanese knotweed on your property, it's important to understand that you're likely going to have to commit to a multi-year effort to eradicate it. These plants are aggressive, stubborn, and will keep trying to resprout. So control measures should be continued for at least 5 years to ensure that the rhizome is fully depleted. And it's also important to note that many measures, if you only do something once, will actually increase densities by stimulating growth through disturbance. So the plant is disturbed and starts sending out new shoots. If you're confronted with an established infestation, your first focus should be on preventing further spread by removing isolated plants and small populations outside the main infested area. So this photo that I had taken yesterday on the roadside, you can see where last year's plant was growing. So you've got this cluster of knotweed here. There's new shoots coming into that dead standing biomass, but there's also these little satellite populations popping up here. They're not part of this original cluster, but these are the ones that you'd want to attack first to prevent further spread. This is a list of possible control methods, but really with such an aggressive invasive, the guidance for Japanese knotweed is actually fairly focused on using digging for small populations and herbicide for large populations. And small populations are typically defined as 15 or fewer plants, large populations being more than 15 plants. This just goes to show that early detection is so important with these highly aggressive invasives that many of these techniques aren't even all that effective against this plant. Of course, it's not to say that you can't win the battle, but you have to put a lot of effort in. So stopping their spread early on, or preventing them from establishing at all in the first place, is really the best route. So we'll talk about digging first. Digging is best used for young plants to eradicate new or early infestations. You can use a shovel to remove smaller plants, but know that you have to remove the entire plant, including all roots. This means digging out and sifting through the soil after the main stem is removed. Any portions of the root system not removed can resprout. So you want to dig as much as you can at the site throughout the spring when the plant will be at the beginning of its growing season. And after a rain like we've had today, when the soil is most pliable, so that when you're trying to get those roots and rhizomes out, you're not splitting it up into many different pieces that can resprout from there. You're going to want to revisit the site 2 or 3 times in the growing season to remove anything that resprouts. And for disposal, place all plant materials in thick black plastic bags. Seal the bags tightly and leave them in direct sunlight for a week. You'll want to let the stems and rhizomes dry out thoroughly for at least a week before disposing them, either by burning or landfilling them. Ontario's Cosmetic Pesticides Ban Act prohibits the non-essential use of prescribed pesticides. There are some exceptions to allow the use of herbicides for control of plants such as Japanese knotweed that are considered detrimental to the environment, economy, agriculture, or human health. If you're dealing with a large infestation on your property, you would have to see if you meet specific criteria to qualify for these exceptions. You'd have to get ministry approval, and unless you're a licensed pesticide applicator yourself, you would have to contract out an applicator. So it's certainly not a straightforward, easy process, but I did just want to mention the possibility here, as it may be the only reasonable option for a property owner with a large, well-established infestation. So likely not something that most of us would use, but if you're unfortunate enough to have such a large infestation, it may be your only option. Okay, let's move on to Phragmites. So Phragmites also goes by the names, common names, European common reed, or common reed grass. For today's purposes, we're just going to refer to it as Phragmites. It's a perennial wetland grass that forms dense, near monoculture stands. It grows and spreads aggressively, reaching heights of more than 5 meters and densities of over 200 stems per meter square. It's native to Eurasia and was likely introduced to North America in the 1800s along the Atlantic coast, but was first recorded in southwestern Ontario in 1948. And since then, it's been spreading, and in 2005 was recognized as Canada's worst invasive plant. So it's now spread throughout Ontario and become one of the most significant threats to Great Lakes coastal habitats. Phragmites can grow in aquatic, semi-aquatic, and terrestrial habitats, so basically everywhere. It thrives in disturbed habitats, including roadsides and ditches, but it does prefer standing water found in wetlands, along lake shores, beaches, wet fields, that sort of thing. While it does prefer that standing water, it can survive in low water areas due to its extensive root system that can reach up to 40 meters in length to go find water. And it can also grow really deep roots to reach water deep down. It's considered very salt tolerant, but sensitive to drought, low oxygen, and water level fluctuations. Again, we can't spend too much time on impacts, but it is important to touch on this at least a bit, because Phragmites does have many negative impacts. It outcompetes native vegetation for really important things like space, nutrients, and sunlight. Adding to that, toxins from the roots of the plant impede the growth of neighboring plants, further eliminating competition. Its impact on wetlands is particularly significant. It can invade agricultural fields, waterfronts, transportation and hydro corridors, can block drainage ditches, damage asphalt through rhizome growth. It can even cause road safety issues by obstructing roadway sightlines. And this photo here shows how dead standing stalks that are left behind each fall are actually a huge risk in terms of fire. So they're very dry and very combustible. And I believe this photo is from near a driving range in Michigan, where dead standing Phragmites biomass lit on fire and burned very quick. So a number of folks at the beginning of the webinar indicated that they are confident identifying Phragmites, but a number also said that they were not. So we're kind of splitting the crowd, and we'll take some time to go over ID here. So this is what you'd be seeing through the dormant stage. So you might still be seeing a lot of this along highways and secondary roads. These are the dead standing stalks. And this is what you'll see when they're actively growing. And this photo I took just yesterday, and this is a mix of, you can see the new green growth intermixed with the flattened dead stalks from the previous year. So the stems are hollow, green, and approximately 0.5 centimeter to 1.5 centimeters in diameter. And again, in the winter, the stems die back and become this tan or beige kind of color. The leaves are alternate, they're flat, and they gradually taper to a point. They're often held at a 45-degree angle from the stem. So you got your leaf inserting on the stem there at roughly 45-degree angle. And they're described as being blue-green in color rather than just a flat green. The seed heads are a purplish brown color, and as the plant matures, they gradually become fluffier in appearance and turn a white to tan color. So they're large, dense, and purplish brown here, and then this is a really small population starting. You can just see little bits of green starting to pop up. But what's more noticeable is these seed heads from last year, these fluffy kind of tan beige colored seed heads. So that's what they look like during the dormant stage. So Phragmites spreads through underground rhizomes, like we talked about Japanese knotweed, but also above ground stolons. As you can see, new stems sprouting up from the nodes on the stolon. This is an image of the rhizomes. Rhizomes make up more than 80% of Phragmites species biomass. So at this point, it's important to note that we do have a native Phragmites species. We'll take a little bit of time to look at the differences here, but again, I want to stress that this is really an introductory discussion for a general audience, and I'll provide resources with more detailed information for those who want to get into the more technical side of things. But the most reliable means of distinguishing between the native and the invasive Phragmites is to use plant tissue for genetic analysis. Now, obviously, we're not going to suggest everyone pursues this option. So what can we look at? Well, native Phragmites rarely develops into monoculture stands. More often, you'll see it growing alongside other species. So you don't see those super dense, all Phragmites populated areas. I should note, though, that when the invasive Phragmites is first establishing itself in an area, it won't necessarily yet have that dense monoculture, so that's not always the greatest identifying feature. But some other features, if you look at the seed head here, we've got the invasive with that dense purplish brown large seed head. The native's a little more sparse and smaller. The invasive has this, again, green, dull, rough kind of stem, whereas the native has a smoother, shinier stem with kind of like a red hue to it. And again, the leaves, we've got the invasive here with this blue-green kind of coloration to it, whereas the native is green or a green-yellow. So just to summarize here, some of the ways we can distinguish between the two: stand density, low versus high. Stem, native Phragmites also doesn't grow as tall as invasive Phragmites. And again, we've got the differences in coloration, texture, the leaves. There's this feature where native Phragmites typically forms a 30-degree angle to leaves to the stem, and invasive is 45. I don't find that to be a great identifier, but it is something to keep in mind. It's not going to be my go-to, but something to keep in mind. And again, the seed heads smaller versus the large, dense seed heads. The same general ideas hold true for Phragmites management as we discussed with Japanese knotweed management. First, do your best to prevent its establishment in the first place. Know how to identify common invasive species and monitor for them on your property. Report invasive species sightings, and then take early action when you spot invasives. It's really critical to control Phragmites before it becomes established. You'll want to remove outlying populations first, like the one shown in this photo. Again, showed this earlier where there's just a few stalks coming up there. Concentrate also on high priority areas first. And again, be prepared to commit to a multi-year effort. These are super stubborn plants that put a lot of effort into trying to come back. So you have to be ready to commit to going back and monitoring and doubling up your efforts. As with Japanese knotweed, there are many techniques described that could theoretically be used in control efforts, but the ones shown here on the slide are those considered to be the most effective in Ontario. Often using more than one method is beneficial, and monitoring afterwards is always, always necessary. Again, be prepared for a multi-year effort. So this slide is divided up into dryland, wet areas, and techniques that should be used always in combination with others rather than on their own. We're going to touch on each of these very briefly and go into a bit more detail on those considered viable options for individual property owners or small community groups. So under dryland, we have herbicide application. This can be very effective, but it requires, again, appropriate authorization, permits, a licensed applicator, and consideration of sensitive habitats and species at risk. We'll talk more about selective cutting and spading on the next slide. Flooding is a technique that can be used where water level manipulations are possible, like dam controlled areas. Flooding acts as a stressor to Phragmites by reducing the amount of oxygen that can travel to the root system. Low oxygen levels can decrease the growth of the plant or cause die-off, which is exactly what we want. To use this technique, you would cut dead stands during their dormant period, and then you would flood them during the primary growth stage where they're trying to or needing oxygen. The greater the water depth that you can maintain, the more effective the flooding will be. And for wet areas, selective cutting and spading, we'll also talk a little bit more about that on one of the next slides, so we'll skip that for now. Some of these additional management techniques to be used in combination with others, we have cultural control. So after a stand has been removed by some means, cultural control is the use of revegetation to encourage growth of native plant species and discourage the invasion of the unwanted plants. Mulching refers to the mechanical cutting of above ground biomass into smaller parts and leaving them on the surface. This technique does not impact the root system and could actually stimulate the growth of Phragmites, so it's definitely not one to be considered as a standalone treatment. It would need to be accompanied by another treatment or technique. Prescribed burning is the deliberate use of fire to remove Phragmites biomass. It has to be done by authorized personnel and is best used in combination with other management techniques like herbicide application. Getting rid of the biomass through fire gives native vegetation a chance to grow and improves follow-up herbicide treatments, for example, by making it easier to see and get at new Phragmites growth. Okay, so selective cutting or spading on dry land. This is a process of manually cutting Phragmites stalks to reduce photosynthesis and deprive the roots and rhizomes of energy. This technique allows for minimal disturbance of the soil and surrounding species. It's very targeted. It's ideal for low density, small infestations where Phragmites is growing in a substrate that can be penetrated by a spade. So for obvious reasons, it's not a great technique for hard, rocky soil where it's tough to get a spade in the ground. It should be done during the primary growth stage before seed heads develop. And if you can, you'll want to repeat the process more than once in a growing season as new shoots arise, and that'll just keep depleting the rhizomes of energy. If you can only do it once, do it when the plant reaches peak height, just as the seed head emerges. This technique is considered moderately effective and can actually be quite successful after several years of repeated spading. But again, it's that repeated concerted effort. It's also important to note that cutting stalks above the soil surface is not considered effective and can actually stimulate growth. So the difference here with the spading method is that you're cutting the stalk below the soil surface. Selective cutting or spading in water. Georgian Bay Forever has been leading the charge on this technique in Georgian Bay for several years now with a great deal of success. Cutting Phragmites beneath the waterline can drown the plant by cutting off the supply of oxygen to lower plant parts. So after the cutting has occurred, the new shoots can't successfully reach the surface to collect oxygen. This is a method that can be applied at small and large scales using either handheld tools on the smaller side of things or amphibious cutting vehicles on the much larger end of things. It's best done during the primary growth stage before seed heads develop, and it's best if the water depth is at least 30 centimeters or deeper. Recommended cutting tools include raspberry cane cutters, spades, and brush cutters. Once the plant material has been cut, it has to be transported to shore for disposal. So that's a large part of it as well. And as with all other control methods, follow-up monitoring and control is necessary. And I know I'm sounding like a broken record now, but you have to be ready to keep with it year over year until you've eradicated the population. Georgian Bay Forever has very detailed instructions on their website on exactly how to use this method, right from identifying and mapping Phragmites to getting a community group together and actually carrying out a cut. So I've provided their web address here, www.gbf.org, and you'll be able to find out lots more information about how they've been successfully using this technique up and down the coast of Georgian Bay. In researching management techniques for Phragmites, you'll likely come across a much longer list of potential control options, as you see some examples here on the screen. These other techniques are considered low efficacy management techniques. Now, this doesn't mean that they cannot work, but they should be considered in conjunction with more effective measures. Or you may just need to keep at it longer because they simply don't work as effectively or as fast. So it's not to say that they cannot work, but they're not the most effective, and you may need to be at it for longer. Now, with most methods, you're going to have to think about disposal of plant material. There's a few different options you can consider. Bagging is good for small amounts or when seed heads need to be removed. You're going to want to put the biomass in a thick industrial grade garbage bag so nothing pokes through or pokes holes in the bag. Tie them up securely and leave the bags until the plant material has decayed and is no longer viable. At that time, you can then burn or dispose of it at an appropriate landfill location, and might want to contact the landfill location ahead of time just to be sure that that's allowed. Burning, where bylaws allow for it, burning can be effective for cut biomass. Ideally, you're going to want to do this with green stalks in a controlled area like a metal barrel, away from other vegetation. The dead, dry stalks are very combustible, and it can be dangerous to light those without being in a controlled area. Before you do this, seed heads should be cut and bagged using the method we just talked about. For drying, there's a few options. You can leave cut stalks on or under a dark colored tarp, put them in paper lawn bags or in dark plastic bags, and you want to let the plant matter sit in the sun for 1 to 3 weeks until it's no longer viable. When the drying is complete, the plants can then be either landfilled or burned. Then finally, leaving on site. This is something that you want to do really carefully. Again, if seed heads are present, cut them off, bag them, remove them. Cut biomass can be piled and left in a dry location away from watercourses on higher ground that will not flood. So there's just a few more considerations there if you're going to leave it on site to make sure it doesn't have a way of spreading. Looking at the time now, I'll go ahead and wrap things up, and I'll pass it back over to Delana to facilitate the Q&A session.